Welcome, everyone. Oh, that's great. I'm going to stand on this side. My name is Sarah Feller. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. I'm not the one that does introductions, so I'm going to read from my little handy-dandy sheet here. So, as many of you probably know, our 30-plus years mission of the library is lifelong learning. This program is a perfect example of that, and we're so glad you're here to learn more with us. For our residents who travel the globe, it's exciting to be able to provide programming that delves deeper into countries such as China, and then we have Japan in April, May. That said, we're so grateful to have with us today Robert Wong, who is a retired U.S. diplomat, to talk and give us a non-political, broad, and thematic view of the history of China and his current thoughts and expertise. So welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Just so you know, this is going to be on YouTube. If you do the search engine thing and look for Bob Wong China, and you'll find it as soon as it's more or less completed, probably by the end of the day. Let me just start off by just explaining this, just so you, this is partially to let you know you're in the right room, but these are characters, Chinese characters going from left to right. First one is the word for middle, and the second one is the word for kingdom. And so that means Middle Kingdom, and just like we have the Mediterranean, which is the center of the world in Latin, this is the center kingdom, and that means China. So we just keep this in mind. One of the more interesting parts is if you look at the first character, it looks like something that would mean middle or center. It just comes out to you. And the second one is field, surrounded by barriers and things inside of it, and that is kingdom. The one thing about Chinese characters is you either know it or you don't know it. You have to be taught it, that this means middle and that means kingdom. If not, there's no alphabet. You can't sound it. You can't read it. There's reasons for that. Okay, this talk is about understanding China. And if you read the book Hawaii by James Michener, he starts off with this long discussion about volcanoes and long discussion or description about the ocean and the violence that came from that. Geography is destiny. Geography creates the people who inhabit that land. So too with China. This is a simplified version just to get you oriented, to use the word. We see to the top, we see here the Gobi Desert and another desert here. These are natural barriers. You have nomadic tribes up here. They would have to go through the Gobi Desert in order to get to the fertile areas which are here. And I'll show you another map in a minute. But most people live in the eastern part of China. So these are natural barriers, and the next one is a little more descriptive look. It's a little more busy. This is the Tropic of Cancer here. It just means that below this are the tropics down here. And so we have the Gobi Desert here, natural barriers. Up here is basically tundra forest. And here we have basically ocean, another natural barrier. Going around here we have jungle that goes into Vietnam. There is, in that area, there is a small opening that leads to Vietnam, and that has been a route for Chinese troops to basically go into Vietnam, and that incursion and that violation of those people continues to this day. Here we have the plateau of Tibet and the Himalayas. So you have 1.4 million people in China, about 1.45 million people in India, and the two civilizations have hardly interacted, partially because of the Himalayas, a natural barrier. Now what this...
You mean
billion people, sorry, came up. The point of this is, for a long time, China has lived in isolation. It is very difficult for the large number of people here to see China, although they knew of their existence. And Europeans only knew through this route here, Afghanistan, which leads you further into the European area. So it was a long, arduous... Is that me? Okay. Okay, sorry. It's a long, arduous trek to go from China to Europe. But it was used. It was the spice route, the soap route, and we'll get into that. Now, started here with just some of the geography, but I do want to introduce two topics, just that will be part of the discussion. One is the concept of an absolute monarch, and this fits into the geography. An absolute monarch is just a political term where the monarch, the emperor, owns everything. The monarch, the emperor, owns you, it owns the land, it owns the ocean, it owns the minerals. It's just a political way of looking at things. And you can compare that to modern ideas like democracy, where the individual can own these things. But in the beginning, under an absolute monarchy, the king owns you. An excellent example, and probably the last remaining example, is Saudi Arabia. You are a subject of the king. He owns you. And actually, if you are one of the things that's interesting about the Arabic language is, when you say the word I own, it doesn't exist. In Arabic, you have to use a different word, and it doesn't mean own. It's like, that thing is to me. And because of that, you have an odd way of speaking Arabic, because that is to me, and then you go on with that object. In the United States, you could say, or in democracies, in English, you can say, I own. So Saudi Arabia, absolute monarchy. And how does an absolute monarchy start? One, that king has the military power to control you, or the way to coerce you. That's just a concept. Well, you'll see this as we go along. Second concept is the mandate of heaven. And it is a very important part when we talk about China. Mandate of heaven, and you can see it right there, is there's only one heaven, and he has granted the rule to one king. However, that can change. Most kings will pass it down to their children, siblings, or someone they designate. However, it also provides for you to lose the mandate if you rule unjustly. So this allows for the concept of rebellion, revolution, that somebody comes in. Your kingdom is corrupt. Your people don't support you anymore because you're not ruling fairly. Mandate of heaven says, king, you're not ruling fairly. We're going to have a rebellion. And now that you have a new king, a new emperor, he says that's because you lost the mandate of heaven. It's a concept, and you will see this time and time again, because in the last, don't worry about the time, but look at the progression. These are the last 3 dynasties in China. The first one here is just, the very important part is, Asians sort of look all alike. Well, there's ethnicities, there's cultural aspects that is important you have to keep in mind. For example, under the Yuan dynasty, they were Mongols, Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan, and they took over China proper, that large area. They basically came in through the Gobi Desert and subdued, let's say, Beijing. And they took over from the king, the emperor. They created a Mongol-speaking dynasty which subjugated the majority population, majority ethnic group in China, which is the Han people. Just so you know that they may all look alike, different ethnicities, different customs. They didn't rule so well, and later on, you can see here, is the Ming Dynasty. Ming vases, very Chinese, because they were Han people. And they ruled for a couple of centuries. Then they lost the mandate, and the next one came on, and this is the last one, called the Qing Dynasty. And that lasted until 1912, when the Republic of China was declared and dynastic rule stopped. That's actually a question, did dynastic rule stop? But we'll just keep going on that. Keep in mind, the way we look at history, everyone looks at history, it's nice and easy to talk about the past tense. And all these little details that get in the way are just details. But in the sweep of history, you've seen, over the centuries, 3 types of people take over China. The most important part is what we call Sino-centricity. The Mongols spoke Mongolian. The Manchus spoke Manchu. At the very end of the dynasties, they all spoke Mandarin because they took on the habits of the court of China. You'll see a little bit more why this happened as we go on. Okay. China is a very old place, and so they invented things like writing, and I explained they didn't have an alphabet. Then they invented, the industry of silk. Some people say the compass, and I put in here, they invented the civil service. And if you go back and just look at it, this is the time when you really think of China as a solidified state, because now they invented a bureaucracy to administer their country. Before that, it was just kings and they would just say things. Now you had a central ruler and he had a bureaucracy to administer it. With paper becoming next, and printing for all those edicts that would come out. And then they also had things like gunpowder. And of course, I put in paper money because it had its problems, and you see the same problems today, where you start printing money, somebody counterfeits it. Okay, let's go on to, this is just the broad part. This is the rise of China. In this talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the rise, and now I'm going to get into the fall of China. Just like the rise of the Roman Empire, the fall of the Roman Empire, because I'll get to it in the third and final part at the end of the talk, which is the part where I say it's make China great again. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But first we've talked about the rise. They've conquered their entire area, that part. They don't have any threats from anybody else. Japan is a vassal state. They pay tribute to the Chinese, and they're protected by an ocean. The only problem historically has been the Koreans, because the Koreans have always been a jumping off point for the Japanese to attack China and the Chinese to attack Japan. But for the most part, because of the natural barrier, they have remained apart. And the rest of the barriers remain too, because the only problem has been with, like I said, Vietnam. Because the rest is jungle, but you could invade Vietnam, and the Vietnamese have never really wanted to take on China. I also, for this one, you can look at the This is the Great Wall, and its purpose was to protect against Mongolians, and eventually, well, and the Manchus. The most important thing about that is the wall did work. It kept out those invaders. Just think about walls. However, at the very end, the wall, they opened the Chinese, of course remember that was the Ming Dynasty. The Ming Dynasty opened up the doors to the Great Wall and let the Manchus in. And that was because the Ming Dynasty was falling apart through bad rule. And they needed the armed troops of the Manchus to come in. So walls work unless, for whatever reason, you decide to open them up. Okay, that ship there, just so you know, is called the Empress of China. It's an American ship, and we'll get into the American role in shipping, international trade in China soon. But the Empress of China was a schooner. It was one of the fastest ships to have invented, partly because Americans, we had a lot of wood, we had sufficient people, and we wanted the Chinese trade. I talked about the Chinese invented silk. They also invented tea, or they consolidated tea. And they had monopolies on tea and silk. The monopolies on tea lasted until 1800. And there's an American part, but this is later on, because this is past 1800, when there was tea in India. Okay, let me just, oh, I missed it. I wanted to include a slide, I'll have to discuss it, about the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is very important to the United States because we took British tea and we dumped it into Boston Harbor. That tea was from China. The way it worked is the British East India Company had a monopoly on buying tea from China and then would, in this case, tax it and then sell it to the United States or the Americans. At that time, the only place to get it, 1775, 76, was China. So the British East India Company would buy it and then use that monopoly to then, because you couldn't get it from anywhere else, you had to buy it through the British had to get it from China, then they would then sell it to us. Very high price to begin with. The important part here is the Chinese demanded it be paid in silver. They didn't want any sort of goods in exchange. They didn't want timber. They didn't want any sort of mechanical devices. They wanted silver and gold. This created a problem, and this is actually important to us, partially because, well, that silver drained the British coffers, because in the United States, basically, if you recall our own history, we traded with the British in goods. We would sell our timber, we would sell our tobacco, and they would keep accounts in Britain of how much that was worth. So there was no, there was no silver from the United States that goes to Britain. It was only silver that was in the British hands, and then the British would then send us manufactured goods, cloth, for example. But for the British, it was a big problem because they had to come up with silver. They had to come up with that. They needed a solution. And the solution was, in 1820, thereabouts, opium. And that started the first of the Opium Wars. And its only purpose was to equalize or stop the drain of silver from the British, and then also open up more ports for not just the British, but for European nations to trade with China, to break up the monopolies. Because at that time, in 1820, for example, there was only one port the Chinese would allow foreigners to use. The foreigners wanted their own ports, because they would then build their own wharves and have their own people, have their own customs inspectors, and they could control it. But the Chinese only wanted one way of doing it, and they wanted silver. So with opium, in a few years, it dramatically changed the way business was done. Chinese, the emperor, which at this time was the Qing dynasty, said, we must stop this. However, by being isolationist, they did their military deteriorate. And so they lost not only the first of the Opium Wars, they lost the second Opium Wars. And so by, let's say, 1890 or so, ports had opened to European trade, and so much so that land was granted to the Europeans. And you'll see it, okay, you'll see it, that Hong Kong was provided, some parts of Hong Kong were just given to the British. Other parts were rented to them for 99 years. Macau was another country, or another island, that was ceded for 99 years, rented to the Portuguese. And you'll see, this was a period that the Chinese called their century of humiliation. They call them the unequal treaties, because they were forced to, by military strength, to give up this land, which as an imperial power, as an absolute monarch, you really hated. And the people themselves suffered. The opium addicts, for example. So this was an example. It's a painting. Basically, just shows up all the Chinese boats, the junks, were being destroyed by modern British cannon, which, remember the British, Lord Nelson, they had just fought a war with another European nation, so they knew warfare quite well. The Chinese were always, aside from being insular, they didn't have much of a navy. The worst was yet to come. The vassal state, Japan, which the United States opened. We remember Commodore Perry sailed into one of the harbors and said, the so-called black ships, and said, you must open your ports, Japan, and we're going to be the first you're going to open it to. And the Japanese saw these ships they'd never seen before, coal-fired ships. They called them black ships. And they said, yep. And by the way, we have a lot to learn from you Americans. Will you show us how you do these things? And so that's what the Japanese embarked on. From the 1860s onward, they learned sailing from the British and army tactics from the Americans. Remember, we had just finished our Civil War, so we had an army. So this, by 1894, the Japanese, basically, in the first Sino-Japanese War, attacked China, and they won. This was a vassal state. For a vassal state to defeat China was also a humiliation that the Chinese remember. Japan continued its warfare. They basically attacked Russia. And so a lot of ports across from Japan are former Russian ports. And actually, if you look at your history, World War II, the Japanese and the Russians have actually never signed a peace treaty. They're technically still at war. Partially it's because of these islands and ports from this time. Another period this is also a period of humiliation for the Chinese. Does that flag look something familiar? I mean, does it look like Florida? Yeah. It's actually the flag for the international settlement in Shanghai. It's partly because the British concluded the treaty that gave them the rights to the international settlements, and the United States was part of that. So it's the cross of St. Andrew. And you see all the flags that are in the middle, and those are all the concessions of all the other European nations that were part of that international settlement. If you saw Emperor of the Sun, that took place in Shanghai. So from, I guess, the 1900s or so to the 1940s, is international settlement, which was basically an international settlement. You saw the big house in Empire of the Sun. That was all an unequal treaty. The Chinese had to give up, but it ended with World War II starting, or World War II, the Japanese. The Japanese basically said, oh, the United States, it actually happened on December 8th, 1941. The Japanese said, British and Americans in Shanghai, you're under Japanese control now, which is part of the war. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, they were basically, if you saw the movie, the settlement basically was now in Japanese control. There's just a map, shows you the English on one part, English here, the Americans are here, and other villages are here, other places. Okay, so we're up to World War II now, and we're getting to the part where the unequal treaties, the period of humiliation will either continue or stop. And there's also a blind spot for Chinese. Okay, this is the American Volunteer Group. 1941, Flying Tigers, you may have seen the movie with John Wayne. That's the emblem for the Flying Tigers under Major General Chenault, whose wife was Chinese. But there's a connection with this cartoon figure and Florida, in that this design, well, maybe not Florida yet, but this design was done by Walt Disney Studios. And so we have a little connection there. But the flying groups flew out of central China, a place called Kunming. And their purpose was to relieve the war in the Pacific by distracting the Japanese so they had to send troops to China, that they had fewer troops to fight on the islands of the Pacific. That was the purpose. It was a strategic purpose. And the Flying Tigers' purpose was to support the mostly Chinese effort to draw away Japanese troops from the Pacific. So it was very important. However, one of the problems you have nowadays is that if you go to Kunming, or you go, did I lose this? Okay. You go to Kunming, you will not find any evidence of American support for this effort with the Japanese. Battery? Okay. Nick, let me just continue. You can just hear this. And this selective memory is something you'll see as we go into the future, because this is also part of, Make China Great Again, that they have a selective memory, and it's an isolationist aspect. They did it themselves. They had no foreign help against the Japanese. Not true. This is a Republic of China general on the USS Missouri, if you remember your World War II history. MacArthur, who's right there. is accepting the surrender of the Japanese, and here is a Chinese general to accept the surrender. So it was the Republic of China, not the People's Republic of China, because there was no People's Republic of China then. Let's go on to here. Okay. As I said, in 1941, the Japanese basically took over all the concessions, and that was, you could say, that was the start or the end of the period of humiliation, because at the end of World War II, remember the Chinese had successfully threw out the foreign invader, the Japanese, with American help, and now you have all the concessions, such as Shanghai, were now in Chinese control. The Allies, Americans, basically said, all those concessions, we're giving them back to the Republic of China, in part because the Chinese did their part in the war, in World War II, to fight the Japanese. However, there are two parts that are remaining, Macau and Hong Kong, and that would have to wait. But for the most part, many of the concessionary treaties ended at World War II. Now we have a period of time between then and when this happened in 1972. And we'll get into some of the American side of this, but it's important for us because Nixon, as they say, Nixon was the only one who would go to China. But we'll get into what that means and what that means in the course of history. From 1945, the Chinese and the Allies have succeeded in their victory. However, a civil war was going on even during that period of time when they were fighting against the Japanese. It was between communism and the Republic of China, which had declared itself in 1912, remember. And so now, the Chinese are fighting the Civil War, 1945, and the communists win in 1949. And the Republic of China troops move on, retreat, to the island of Formosa, which is a Portuguese term. They go to the island of Taiwan. For the rest of the 1949, up until 72, the communists are in control of People's Republic of China. They didn't have full, recognition internationally. The Republic of China still did. However, they had control over China. And one of the aspects you're going to see is, how do they rule? Their job is to make things better for their people. They still have the mandate of heaven to consider if they're going to continue their rule. But it is, remember, it's a revolutionary communist, or actually the secret is just that revolutionary. They have a revolutionary zeal, and that's the best way to describe it. The second part about revolutionary zeal in countries, and this is also this is important, is there are going to be factions within the ruling people. The communists have taken over. They have one communist party, that's communist doctrine. However, there are factions. There are the leftists, people who say, the dictatorship of the proletariat must succeed. We will have our 5-year plans and they will work. And then there are the internationalists, the pragmatic people who say, yes, but couldn't we sort of like make contracts with other people and sort of work with them? You'll see, because that goes on until basically now. This is important because this is the why question. Why did Nixon go to China? He went to China, not for China. He went to China because he wanted to end the Vietnam War. My opinion, but you look at this. Look at the times. In February of 1972, he went to China. And then you could see how the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, felt this is something we got to deal with. And so they begin a military offensive, the Easter offensive. And back and forth until it finally gets to the point where in December of that year, you have basically remember the Christmas bombings? We forget how fast time went on during this period of time. Basically, Nixon went to China, and the Vietnam War sort of ended with the Paris Peace Accords in '73. So it worked for him. He also gets reelected, by the way. So it worked. He ended the Vietnam War. The light was at the end of the tunnel. This is important because one of the things as a Foreign Service officer is 4/5 of all foreign policy is domestic. Everything we do overseas is because of a domestic requirement. The other 1/5, is because of some relationship that we would desire, but everything we do is domestic. Let me just put that there. I'll also have to read is the burglars were arrested in Watergate. So he had several. Nixon was this very smart guy. He had several things in the fire. Okay. Okay. This is going to be the end of the second part because 1997, the British give up Hong Kong. In 1999, the Portuguese will give up Macau. So all the unequal treaties and all the the century of humiliation has now ended with the giving up of, or the return of Hong Kong and Macau. And you see here the Chinese flag, and you see here that the Union Jack has gone down. It is now sovereign, back in Chinese sovereignty. I should mention in passing that the purpose, the agreement that the British left with the Chinese is there will be a 50-year period of a special administrative district in which the Chinese will not interfere, and they will keep everything as Hong Kong and as British as it was in 1999. That was the deal. That's the Hong Kong flag. It's Hong Kong's own flag, but it's a Chinese special administrative district. And this one is the Macau flag. Again, a special administrative district. And I'll leave it to you whether the Chinese have kept their end of the bargain. Because this is important. Countries, when you give your word, however way you do it, need to keep their end of the bargain. Okay, this is 1979. I talked about factions before, and I want to make sure I wrap up with the third part. There have always been people who want to go towards democracy or go towards the, I guess, the Western ways. With the communists, they have taken the mandate of heaven and they changed it a little bit. They call it the grand bargain. The grand bargain is, we will increase your standard of living, we will make things easier for you. However, you give up your rights. You will listen to the dictatorship of the proletariat, communist term. In other words, you will listen to the Communist Party. You will give up your freedoms for the sake of the revolution. And that means you give up your liberties, that we would consider liberties. Remember, as an absolute monarch, you have no liberties. And that continues to this day. So in 1979, people who thought there should be better, their living standard had increased. since 1949, since Nixon. They've joined most of the world economy. However, the communists said, yes, but you have no freedom of speech. And to this day, if you look under Tiananmen Square, and you see, well, let me put it this way, if you talk to a Chinese person, People's Republic of China, and ask them about Tiananmen Square, they have no knowledge. Okay, I'm going to this is the sort of the end of the second part, or the beginning of the third part. This is a removal in the National Congress Party, which happens every 5 years in China. This just happened in 2022. These things are very well scripted. It's rehearsed. Everything happens for a purpose. So the TV cameras are put in, Western media is allowed, well, Westernized people who cover the National Party Congress, and this individual is ejected. Why? And why so public? Because he is the last of the, what would I say, the new type of people who have come in, the practical internationalists who remain in the National Congress Party. Everyone else has been replaced. And that is what I mean when I say that there is now a new emperor in China, because all of those people are this person's his hand-picked people. Everyone else, the traditionalists, it's not a communist party now. It's basically a party of Xi. Let me just say it directly. Okay, we're going to get to the end, so I want to take some questions. You know where China is going, in the sense that they're now economically number 2 in the world, that they are have a trajectory that we see. However, there are things that are in their path, and this is one of them. Because of their 1979, they started the one-child policy. And the one-child policy basically meant you would have one child. And they have a very efficient bureaucracy, something that the emperor started, and a very efficient way of administering these things down to the local level and a personal level. Point is here that they have now reached a point where their population is going to diminish, or the trends are that way. Now, this is where it's just one thing. This is a foreign service story. So I was it's actually an African nation. I skipped that part where I didn't introduce myself, but most of my foreign service career has been in Africa. And of a 25-year career, foreign service officers are expected to spend 20 years out of the United States. We very rarely are in the United States. So for a federal worker, I have no idea about Washington. But I can tell you, being outside, that Washington needs to communicate more, which is actually one reason why I'm here. Getting back to foreign service. I'm in Nigeria, and the Africans are an ascendant people, writ large. There are 50 countries there. In this particular place, there are many embassies. One of them was the Irish embassy. Very rare, because most of the time you never meet an Irish diplomat. He told me, since he rarely meets an American, he said, there are about 8 million people, who are of Irish descent in the United States. we in Ireland want them back. He wasn't kidding. Partly because this, if you look at this right here, at the time of the potato famine, there were 6.5 people in Ireland, the entire island, with 2 million left for the United States. Others perished. And those were the most fertile, most productive people Ireland had. They all left. You saw Titanic. And their population went down from there. So much so, but basically by 1960, there were only 3 million people in Ireland. And this conversation took place in the 1990s. That's why he said, remember, Ireland was becoming ascendant. They had, for one thing, they had put in compulsory high school education. Everybody had to go to school and graduate from high school. And they had free universities, Trinity universities, they were free. He said, the only thing that's stopping us from doing more is we don't have the people. That's why we want you Americans, or Irish Americans, to come to Ireland. I said, okay. But he was serious. And this has implications, because this is the construct is that your most productive people are from 20 to 40 years old. From 40 to 60, they become even more productive because they're experienced, a little bit older, but experienced. The consumers of your economy are 0 to 20, but they are your seed corn. Those are the people who will become the producers and the productive people later on. If you don't have a good population mix or a good number of people coming up, 0 to 20, you're in trouble. So it makes sense that if you're a population planner, if you're anybody, you want to have at least 25% of your population 0 to 20 years old. And 25% also 20 to 40 years old. And you don't want too many people beyond age 60, but they're there, so you got to deal with them. But so here's the problem. In China, oops. They don't have it, okay. In China, they have currently 10% who are from 0 to 20 years old. 10% of their population. They face an extreme population squeeze if they're going to look for people in their 20 to 40s, because they're not going to be there to expand the economy. So, the big thing has always been mandate of heaven, turned into the grand bargain, where we will increase your standard of living, but you give us your rights. You don't expand that standard of living. The people whose rights are being, I say trampled on, but being curbed, will be very angry. And that is one of the problems that China is facing now. And so let me just leave that there. And this is for future, you have some questions. I can get this to you somehow. But the point here is there's a lot of articles you could read that talk about this very same issue, where the economic cliff, the demographic cliff that China faces will constrain their ability to manage their own economy and therefore their own population. So with that, I can take some questions if people have that in mind. So I want to thank you very much for your attention.
You mentioned the Michener book on Hawaii.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a similar, well, he was quite factual in his research, and is there a similar book of the history of China or Japan?
I have to say that, not that approaches it from that way. He starts off in geography, which is true, geography is destiny, and then he goes on how that, works with the people and the problem they have with the geography. And nothing like that I know about from China. Not like Poland or the Covenant and things like that. Sorry.
So historically, China has never really been expansionist, but we see them kind of building these inroads, into Africa, into South America now. They're one road, one belt road across to Europe. Right. Thoughts on that in terms of expansion?
Yes. When they talk about expansion, it's not so much expansion, but it's actually to meet their domestic requirements. In Africa, for example, they build stadiums, they build roads. It's all done with Chinese labor. The idea is they need to keep their population employed. And so they say to whatever country, and they say, we would like to give you a stadium or a road. What they mean is, we would like to send in our people to build it, and we would like to have you pay for it and bond it out with debt that we will keep. And so they win because they're now basically employing their people. They're using foreign Africans to pay for that employment. And at the same time, they're basically sometimes at higher than market interest rates, doing a great bank job on the Africans. So you now see, you may start to see some of those, basically they're unequal treaties with the Africans, to put it one way. But it's to meet their domestic requirements, to expand their economy. So it may be expansionist, but it's not expansionist in that way. Okay, Patrick.
Bob, do you have an opinion on what the current tariff activity will have specifically with our relationship with China?
Well, this is mostly a United States domestic issue. I mean, it's not just China, it's everybody else. And as a general rule, I could go into my talk about the Smoot-Hawley Act of 1926, which basically made worse the United States depression and their depression around the world. Oh, I shouldn't get started on that one. But that was Smoot-Hawley Act was tariffs. And when you put on a tariff, they put on a tariff. And basically, it just reduces the amount of economy that the world has, because what happens is, if you read The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, which 1776, he basically said everybody should do what they do best, and then trade. Tariffs undermine that concept of do what you do best because you're most efficient. It disrupts and gives the wrong signals on purchasing and buying, or buying and purchasing, because it basically the cost of goods is basically a signal that that good is worth that amount. Now you have something that's arbitrarily put on 25%, 40%. You could have done the same amount of work if you just put on 10%, or 2%, or 1%. So the shotgun approach is inefficient because it really doesn't look at the actual product. So I can't answer the question directly, but tariffs as a general rule, fine-tuning is really a good way of doing things, and tariffs as a general rule undermines, send us what you do best, let the information in the cost determine what gets purchased. Sir?
What do you see as the long-term destiny for the Chinese?
Well, I mentioned the demographic cliff. Actually, every single nation in the entire world, except for like the Africans and maybe the Latin nations, have similar issues. You grow an economy by having more people. So the long-term part is they're of their own making, in that they themselves have the one-child policy, which is already feeling itself. This is a fact. That people train has already been born, and you need to add to it. So the future is already here, but you give us another 30 years and you'll see the answer. But the only nation that actually will increase its population, only Western nation, is actually the United States. And that's only because of our immigration, or historic immigration patterns. Because people come here, they're usually the youngest people with the most energy, and they usually have the desire to be educated. All the Western nations have difficulties, like Ireland, getting trained people or getting people who want to do things. And in the United States, society is actually very easy to go into. We have a big space. European nations, they have a small space. They're still very standoffish. You could be born in Germany and not be German. Your parents could be born in Germany and not be German citizens. In the United States, we do it differently. Sir?
Of the 10% under 20, what percentage are women in China? The youngest
Well,
generation,
yeah, there is
imbalance.
there is an imbalance, and I forget it's worse than, I think somebody said it's like 48% or less. I don't know the numbers, but there is an extreme imbalance. You have a lot of unhappy bachelors.
And last I knew, you needed a woman to make a baby. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's changing.
I said maybe.
Yes, ma'am?
But aren't there, for the future, because I know Japan and Korea, they're like it's in a population, they're just not having babies and they're very afraid. But, if we keep taking from CDC and leave World Health, our bright people are going to go over to those countries. Because we already have that. There is a book by Kai-Fu Lee, and it's about AI between Silicon Valley and China and who's going to win. And a lot of it there's an intertwining because you've got, you have Google, but you have Apple and all of these things. And so won't there be a balancing that maybe bright talent from the U.S. will go, there'll be joint ventures. And, China will probably end up being on top because of that.
So the question is?
Well, the future, when you say, even though they have this population disparity now, that they will still be able to draw talent from other countries to balance that out. Say they don't get all the, like you say.
That's actually one of the, if you read the literature mentioning, that's actually some of the comments people will make, that there is automatic balancing because of population flows. One of the problems is, I mentioned the Chinese characters. Okay, the average person needs to memorize, not just learn to read, but they have to memorize those pictograms, and the average person needs about, your average vocabulary is maybe 10,000, so you have to memorize 10,000 characters to be a college graduate. About there. The amount of vocabulary you have when you read a book, you know at least 10,000 words. So that's the problem, is that they need to integrate those people. Korea, they have the lowest of all the, quote, westernized nations, almost developed nations. They have the lowest population rate. They do have an issue. Japan, too, but Japan saw it a long time ago. That's one reason why 20 years ago you saw them go into robots, because they realized they have a population problem. They have an integration problem because it's very difficult to learn Korean, very difficult to learn Japanese, it's difficult to learn Chinese too, for that matter.
She taught herself Korean, and she was there for a month recently.
Oh, okay, good for you.
But Koreans they started out with Chinese, you're right, the lettering, and then they changed it because the common man could not learn it. And King Sejong said, we're going to have a language
They have
And it's so much easier. It's
a simplified version.
Simplified version.
Yep.
you know.
Anything else? Other than that, I want to thank you very much for your attention and your attendance, and